So we learned that a disciple is simply someone who follows someone else or someone else's teachings. And so we know that Jesus, while he was here on earth, called 12 men, ordinary men, to follow him. And they've become known as the 12 disciples. And they were Jesus' best friends while he was here on earth. I think sometimes we don't think about Jesus being human in terms of his friendships, but he had friends just like you guys do, just like I do. And just like we have friends, we also have within our circle of friends even closer friends, and Jesus had that with his disciples too. The Bible seems to indicate that there were some disciples that were even closer friends with him than others, even though they were all friends of Jesus. So we're going to go ahead and start talking a little bit about the disciples. We don't know a lot about every single one of them, but we're going to just get a little bit of a snapshot about what we do know. So we're going to start off by talking about a guy named Simon Peter. And most of you are probably familiar a little bit with Peter. Peter was known as a fisherman in the area. He was also known as being a little bit of a hothead. He tended to be very passionate about his work, and there were a lot of good qualities about Peter. He's typically one that is thought of to have been a good leader, sort of like the leader of the pack. We know that he voices his opinion oftentimes in the Bible. Sometimes he gets himself into trouble. We also connect Peter to the miracle of Jesus walking on the water, because we know that Jesus had Peter step out of the boat in faith and walk on water. But we also know that Peter, despite his great faith in doing what Jesus asked him to do and being able to walk on water, as he was walking towards the Lord in that storm, he started to take his eyes off of Jesus and started to fear, probably like I would have too, and like you would too. He started to fear the storm and took his eyes off of Jesus and began to sink. Jesus then reaches down and pulls him out of the water. And I love that, because it just shows how Peter showed awesome faith, and sometimes we do that too. And then how also, even in the same story, he shows how he also lost some faith and took his eyes off of Jesus. And we do that. I know I do that too. Sometimes I think about things happening in life, like right now with this whole virus situation. We think, why are you allowing this to happen, Lord? Again, we don't see the whole picture, do we? We only see the little tiny part of it. We only see part of the puzzle, whereas God sees all of it. So we know that Peter was involved in some passionate situations. For instance, when the guards came to arrest Jesus the night that Jesus was arrested at the Garden of Gethsemane, we know that Jesus seemed very calm, and Peter was ready to get up and defend his Lord, and we love his passion. And in so doing, he actually takes his sword and cuts off one of the soldier's ears. And what does Jesus do? He very calmly fixes the ear, heals the man's ear. That kind of blows my mind about that. But we do know that Jesus also tells Peter the night before his death that he's going to betray him or deny him. Sorry, not betray him, but deny him. And Peter's like, "No, Lord, there's no way I would ever do that. It's not going to happen." And yet we know that it does happen. And so how many times, are we in our bubble of Christian friends and we would say we would never do anything against God's will and so forth. But then sometimes we end up getting ourselves into a situation where we don't really want to stand up for our faith. And so again, Peter, who was friends with Jesus himself, did that. He denied Jesus. And so Peter, I think, is very relatable for so many people because of his leadership, his passion, his desire to follow the Lord, but yet also his sinful nature and his humanness comes through, and he messes up a lot. And every single time, Jesus allows Peter to be able to be forgiven and still continues to use him. We know that Peter's name was Simon, and Jesus changes it and calls him Peter. He says, "Your name will now be Peter," and it means rock. And later on, Jesus tells Peter, "On you, Peter, on this rock, I shall build my church." And we know that Peter, after Jesus went back to heaven in his ascension, we know that Peter and the disciples went and spread the gospel. They went talking about what they just experienced with their Lord and Savior. And many of the disciples ended up dying for their faith in Jesus Christ, but they also led a lot of people to the Lord, and many people became Christians because of this. And we know that Peter had an experience where he was preaching and thousands of people came to know Jesus. And so we know that the disciples were men of God who were used. They were just ordinary people, just like you and me, who were used in a mighty way because they had faith and they allowed Jesus to work in their lives. So we also know that Peter sort of started the early church, or the first church. And again, that's not a building that we're talking about, but we're talking about people who have accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. We are a part of the church. Peter started that. And he and the disciples started that. I oftentimes ask myself, I wonder which disciple it was who told someone, who then told someone, who then told someone, and they sort of passed it down the lane, passed it like, how we do that sometimes, that game. And finally, it came to my family, and I heard it. And I would love to be able to trace back, just like we can with our ancestors sometimes. I'd love to be able to trace back which disciple was the disciple responsible for starting my family thread. Now, I know that Paul, who was not one of the 12, he was focused on typically going out and reaching the Gentiles. And so it could have been from him too. But I oftentimes think about that. So moving on then from Peter, we have his brother. His brother's name is, do you know? His brother's name is Andrew. Peter and Andrew were both fishermen. They sailed together and fished, and they did this with another set of brothers, which we'll talk about in a second. Andrew, can you imagine what it would have been like to be Andrew? Andrew was Peter's brother. And a lot of times in our families, you might have one sibling who has a little bit more of leadership qualities and another sibling who sort of stays back in the background a little bit more. It was no different for these guys. Andrew appears to have been the brother to sort of stay in the background a little bit. He was one who I think just kind of sat back and watched Peter do his thing and probably laughed a little bit as Peter got himself into some sticky situations. I can imagine with my own boys, that could potentially be something where someone would laugh at someone else who got themselves into a predicament. However, my boys are very much there for one another, and I think Andrew and Peter were probably the same way. Andrew was known for bringing people to Jesus. He was a follower of Jesus, but he also brought many people to Jesus. He wasn't the one to want to be in the limelight, kind of like his brother, but he was very content to bring people and hand them over and then let Jesus do his thing. Andrew is the one who brought the boys lunch with the feeding of the 5,000. Andrew's the one who gave that lunch to Jesus and noticed that the boy had the lunch and took it to Jesus. So moving on then, we said that Peter and Andrew were fishermen, and they were fishermen with another set of brothers named James and John. And those names kind of roll off of our tongue. Peter, James, and John. We hear the threesome a lot. James and John were brothers, and they were the sons of Zebedee. They were also the fishermen, like I said, and they kind of palled around together a lot. John calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, and again, doesn't mean that Jesus didn't love all of his disciples, but we kind of gather, oftentimes in the Bible, we read these names that are oftentimes with Jesus. Like, I think all of the disciples were probably there, but for some reason, we always hear Peter, James, and John. Sometimes we hear Andrew's name too. And so I think those disciples were the ones who were kind of Christ's inner circle of friends. You guys have your friends, like our class, we're all friends, but then we have our best friends, like those who we would call over just to hang out. We have our best buddies, and I think that's kind of how they were too with Jesus. Then we are moving on to a disciple named Philip, and Philip was someone who Jesus actually came to him and said, "Follow me." He said the direct words to follow me. Jesus also talked to Philip. And Philip wanted to let his friend Nathaniel know about Jesus. And so we'll talk about Nathaniel in just a second. We're going to talk about a guy named Thomas. Thomas was one of the disciples who was kind of known for being the questioner of the group. In today's churches, sometimes we refer to him as Doubting Thomas. If you recall, after Jesus died, his disciples were gathered probably in the same upper room where they had the Last Supper. And they were sad and they were mourning. And we know that Peter came back and was so excited because he had seen Jesus and the disciples had gotten word that Jesus was alive. And Thomas is the one who said, unless I can actually put my fingers into his hands where the nails were and into his side where the sword pierced, I'm not going to believe that it's him. And we know that the story goes on to say, later they were gathered and Jesus appears to them. And Thomas needed to see it. In John chapter 14, we also have a discussion where Jesus is talking to his disciples, telling them that he's going to go and prepare a place. And Thomas is the one who's asking all these questions. And sometimes I think Thomas gets a bad rap for doing that, but I think it's good. It shows us that even Thomas, who hung out with Jesus for all those years and saw what Jesus did, he had questions too, and he didn't understand fully who Jesus was in terms of, are you really who you say you are? And so I think that's very refreshing and reassuring to me, because there are times when I don't understand everything that's going on too. And I wasn't hanging out with Jesus in person for 3.5 years like those guys were, and they still had questions. So it kind of makes me feel a little bit better when I have questions too. Then we move on to Matthew. Matthew also was called Levi, and he was a tax collector. And we've talked about tax collectors and how they were hated in this time period by the Jewish people because they sort of ripped off the Jewish people. The Romans would put a tax on to the Jewish people, and they would have certain public figures called publicans. They would have them in charge of it, like government officials, more or less. And so Matthew was one of them. And so I can imagine he was just hated by many of the Jewish people. So for him to be called by Jesus was a big deal. And so many people were like, Jesus, do you know who he is? Are you sure you want him to be part of your group? But of course we know that Jesus says yes. And so Matthew was a tax collector. So we've got fishermen, we've got ordinary Joe Schmo people who we don't know much about. We've got a tax collector. Then we also have a family member of Jesus. We know that James was a half-brother of Jesus. Can you imagine what those celebrations, those Passover celebrations, and those different kinds of feasts that they would have as Jewish people, what that would have been like, these parties that they would attend? And can you imagine how the conversation around the table would be? I can just imagine Mary, sharing stories of what her kids are doing, and Jesus never does anything wrong. I can imagine how that must have been for James growing up, always being in the shadow of his brother Jesus, who was perfect. I don't know how that was for him, but that could have been uncomfortable. But James comes around, and he does decide to follow Jesus, and I love that he's a family member of Jesus following him. And then we have a couple other guys here to mention that we don't know a whole lot about, but there is a guy named Thaddeus. Thaddeus is kind of, he's referred to often as Thaddeus and as Jude. So in some of the books of the Bible, you will run down and read through the different disciples, and you'll hear Thaddeus mentioned. And then in another book, you'll see him listed as Jude. It's the same person. So Thaddeus and Jude are the same person. And then we have a guy named Simon. This is not Simon Peter. This is just plain old Simon. And Simon was something called a zealot. And a zealot was someone who was completely against the Roman authority. They didn't want Rome's authority over top of them, and they were not they just didn't take well to the Romans. And they also didn't take well to any Jewish people who were abiding or supporting what the Romans were doing. For instance, Matthew, he was a tax collector. He was kind of supporting what Rome was doing, even though he was a Jew. And so Simon, who was a Jew, took great offense to that. And so his group, the Zealots, were very much about going against Roman people and any Jewish supporters of Rome. So I can imagine the tension that could have been there in that group of people when you've got Matthew, the tax collector, and you've got Simon, the Zealot, all in the same group of people. I think Jesus had a great sense of humor, and it just makes me laugh when I think about all the different personalities and all the different backgrounds that these disciples came from. Then we've got a guy named Judas, who we are familiar with. He was the treasurer of the group, and we also know he's also known for, sadly, betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He turns Jesus over to the Sanhedrin, and we know that he betrays Jesus. We also know that Jesus was very much aware that this was going to happen. In fact, at the Last Supper, he goes on and says to Judas, you go and do what you need to do. And I don't think all of the disciples really understood fully what was about to happen, but we know that Judas is the guy who betrays Jesus. And then we know about a guy named Bartholomew. Bartholomew is one of those guys who also is known by another name, and his other name is Nathaniel. And we know that Jesus talks to him and tells him, hey, I saw you while you were sitting underneath that fig tree. And when Jesus shares that with him, Bartholomew, Nathaniel, realizes, wow, this guy really knows a lot about me. So those are the 12 disciples that Jesus called to follow him while he was here on earth. And you're gonna go ahead and do a project next week related to them. So this is your video of your, just kind of like a little capsule of who they are. We would have gone a little bit deeper had we been in school, but for the sake of our video and the time for it, I just wanted to give you a little snapshot. I may ask you to delve in and research one of them and decide who you think you're most like or who you like the best, but we'll save that for another time. All right, you can always go back and watch the video of the song of the 12 disciples to try and get them into your head, but I'd like you to get familiar with those 12 guys and who they were. All right, see ya.